What if Game of Thrones Season 8 had a secret plotline that was never revealed? What if Daenerys Targaryen was pregnant with Jon Snow's child all along? The final season of Game of Thrones left fans with countless questions, but few theories have sparked as much debate as the idea that Daenerys was secretly carrying an heir to House Targaryen. With heavy foreshadowing in Season 7, subtle visual clues in Season 8, and behind-the-scenes reports of major last-minute script changes, many believe that a pregnancy storyline may have originally been planned only to be abandoned in the show's rushed conclusion. But why would the writers cut such a game-changing twist? Could a pregnancy have softened Daenerys' tragic downfall, making it harder for the audience to accept her transformation into the Mad Queen? Would Jon Snow have still killed her if he knew she was carrying his child? And how would this have reshaped the future of Westeros? In this deep dive, we'll explore the evidence, hidden clues, and potential reasons why Game of Thrones may have scrapped one of its most dramatic storylines. If true, this missing plot thread could have completely altered the ending of the show, adding more emotional weight, more tragedy, and a very different fate for House Targaryen. Let's unravel the mystery. Foreshadowing in Season 7, was the show setting up a pregnancy storyline? One of the most significant aspects of Game of Thrones was its carefully planted foreshadowing throughout the series. The show was renowned for setting up major twists and character arc seasons in advance, and the idea of Daenerys Targaryen conceiving a child was hinted at several times in Season 7. Unlike random throwaway dialogue, these moments stood out as narrative setups, leading fans to believe that Daenerys' pregnancy would be a key storyline in Season 8. The most crucial moment occurs when Jon Snow and Daenerys discuss her inability to bear children. While sailing to White Harbor, Daenerys confesses to Jon that she cannot have children because of what Mirri Maz Duur told her after Khal Drogo's death. The sorceress claimed that Daenerys' womb was cursed, preventing her from ever carrying another child. However, Jon immediately questions her certainty, pointing out that Mirri Maz Duur might not have been telling the truth. This is an incredibly important moment because it challenges a long-held belief that Daenerys and the audience accepted as fact. If the show never intended to revisit Daenerys' fertility, there would have been no need for Jon to question it. The moment feels like an intentional attempt to plant doubt in Daenerys' mind and the viewers' minds as well. Why set up this discussion, only to never mention it again? Given how tightly scripted Game of Thrones was in earlier seasons, such an exchange would not have been included without a narrative purpose. Furthermore, Jon and Daenerys' love scene in the Season 7 finale was presented in a way that strongly hinted at consequences beyond just romance. Unlike previous relationships depicted in the show, this union was heavily emphasized, with Tyrion Lannister watching from the shadows with a concerned expression. His reaction suggested that something about their union deeply worried him, and while some assumed he feared Daenerys would favor Jon over him, others believed he was already considering the possibility of a pregnancy and its political consequences. Another major clue appears in Daenerys' growing fixation on her legacy in Season 7. She repeatedly emphasizes that she wants to break the wheel and leave behind a new world for the people of Westeros. This shift in mindset coincides with her growing attachment to Jon, making it plausible that the show was setting up a mother-child dynamic where she realizes that her true legacy is not the Iron Throne, but her child. This would have added an entirely new layer to her story, giving her an emotional reason to rethink her approach to ruling Westeros. Given all these moments, Mirri Maz Duur's possibly false prophecy, Jon planting doubt in Daenerys' mind, Tyrion's concerned reaction, and Daenerys' growing focus on legacy, it's difficult to believe that her potential pregnancy was not at least considered by the writers. The setup was too deliberate and too thematically rich to be ignored, yet Season 8 never follows through on these seeds of foreshadowing, leaving the audience with a frustrating narrative gap. Daenerys' physical changes in Season 8, a hidden clue? While some might dismiss fan theories about subtle visual and behavioral changes in Game of Thrones, Daenerys Targaryen's appearance, demeanor, and overall presentation in Season 8 suggest that something deeper was happening behind the scenes. The final season saw a significant shift in her posture, clothing, and emotional state, fueling speculation that these were intentional storytelling choices meant to hint at an unspoken pregnancy arc. Fans of the series have long noted that Game of Thrones has used costuming, cinematography, and character body language to foreshadow major plot developments. Given that Daenerys' pregnancy was strongly hinted at in Season 7, these details have led many to believe that Season 8 was initially meant to reveal this development but ultimately never addressed it directly. One of the most visibly notable changes was Daenerys' wardrobe. Throughout Game of Thrones, Daenerys' costumes evolved in a way that reflected her character growth, status, and personal journey. In earlier seasons, she wore lighter, flowing fabrics that symbolized her youth, vulnerability, and connection to the Dothraki. As she grew into her role as a conqueror, her wardrobe shifted to regal, structured outfits in Targaryen colors black, red, and silver, emphasizing her authority and Dragonlord heritage. However, in Season 8, her costumes became noticeably bulkier and more layered, especially in contrast to her more streamlined looks in Season 7. Some viewers speculate that this was a deliberate visual cue to conceal a pregnancy bump, allowing the show to subtly allude to her condition without explicitly addressing it. Game of Thrones has a history of using costume changes to symbolize character transformations. For example, Sansa Stark's shift from soft, flowing pastels to dark, heavily armored attire reflected her transition from an innocent noble girl to a hardened political strategist. Likewise, Cersei Lannister's shift to military-inspired black dresses mirrored her increasing ruthlessness and authoritarian grip on the throne. If Daenerys were truly pregnant, her Season 8 wardrobe could have been designed to suggest her condition while also reflecting her increasingly rigid, militant mindset as she became more desperate to secure the throne. Beyond costuming, Daenerys' physical demeanor and overall energy levels seemed to shift dramatically in the final season. Many fans noted that she appeared more exhausted, more fragile, and emotionally volatile, all of which could be attributed to the overwhelming grief she experienced after losing Jorah Mormont, Missandei, and 2 of her dragons. However, there is another possible explanation: pregnancy can cause extreme fatigue, mood swings, nausea, and heightened emotional responses, symptoms that align closely with Daenerys' erratic behavior in Season 8. While grief, isolation, and stress certainly played a role in her increasingly paranoid and impulsive actions, a pregnancy could have compounded these emotions, making her more prone to outbursts, less rational in her decision-making, and more susceptible to paranoia about betrayal. The combination of personal losses, war pressures, and possible pregnancy hormones could explain why her descent into madness felt so abrupt and uncharacteristic compared to previous seasons. One particular moment that has fueled much of this speculation occurs in Episode 4 of Season 8, shortly after the Battle of Winterfell. Daenerys is seen placing her hand over her stomach in a private moment, a gesture often used in film and television as a subtle hint at pregnancy. This scene is never referenced again, and there is no dialogue to explain her action, making it feel like an abandoned plotline or a leftover visual clue from a script that had been altered. In storytelling, particularly in film and television, characters touching their stomachs without explicit reason is a well-known cinematic cue for pregnancy. If Daenerys was indeed pregnant, this would have been a small but intentional moment to foreshadow the reveal. Had the show followed through with a pregnancy storyline, it would have profoundly impacted Jon Snow's decision to kill Daenerys in the finale. If Jon had known she was carrying his child, his internal conflict would have been even more intense, as he wouldn't just be ending the reign of a ruler he believed to be dangerous, he would have been killing his own unborn heir. This would have added a new layer of complexity to his fateful decision, making it an even more agonizing and morally ambiguous choice. Daenerys' final words to Jon, "You are my queen, now and always," would have taken on an even deeper, tragic meaning if she were secretly pregnant. Instead of being solely about their love and devotion to each other, it could have also been her way of telling him that their child was the future of House Targaryen, a future that Jon would ultimately end with his own hands. The emotional stakes of Daenerys' death would have been even higher, making the finale far more heartbreaking and controversial. Despite all these potential clues, Game of Thrones never directly addresses the pregnancy theory, leaving fans to speculate whether these details were intentional hints at a discarded plotline or simply coincidences. Some argue that the showrunners may have deliberately left small clues in the final season, knowing that they had abandoned the pregnancy arc but still wanting to acknowledge it in a subtle way. Others believe that the hand over stomach moment, the costume changes, and the behavioral shifts were simply unintentional coincidences with no deeper meaning behind them. One possible explanation for why the pregnancy subplot may have been abandoned lies in behind-the-scenes decisions and production constraints. It is well known that the final season was heavily condensed, reducing what could have been multiple seasons' worth of content into just 6 episodes. Given the showrunners' desire to wrap up the series quickly, they may have decided that introducing a pregnancy arc would have been too complicated to resolve in the short time left. Another factor could have been concerns about audience perception. Given that Daenerys' downfall and execution were already controversial, revealing that she was pregnant could have made Jon's actions far more divisive. Instead of seeing him as a reluctant hero making an impossible choice, audiences might have viewed him as a villain who murdered not only Daenerys but also his unborn child. This would have made it much harder for the show to justify his self-imposed exile beyond the wall as an appropriate resolution for his character. Additionally, if Daenerys had been pregnant, it would have raised questions about the fate of her child and the future of the Targaryen bloodline. If she had died while carrying Jon's heir, would her followers have fought to protect the child's claim to the throne? Would Jon have been pressured to stay in Westeros and raise the child as the next ruler? The political ramifications of her pregnancy would have been enormous, potentially leading to an entirely different ending to the series. Instead of a final season that left House Targaryen effectively extinct, a pregnancy arc could have kept the possibility of a future Targaryen ruler alive, leaving room for a different conclusion. Ultimately, the question remains, was Daenerys truly pregnant in Season 8, or were these clues just unintentional details with no greater significance? While the show never explicitly confirms or denies the theory, the combination of foreshadowing in Season 7, costume and behavioral changes in Season 8, and unaddressed visual cues suggest that Game of Thrones may have once considered this storyline but ultimately abandoned it before the final scripts were locked. If the pregnancy had been confirmed, it would have fundamentally changed the way audiences viewed Daenerys' final moments, adding more tragedy, more emotional stakes, and possibly an entirely different resolution to her arc. Instead, the show left this thread unresolved, adding it to the long list of missed opportunities and lingering mysteries from the final season. Whether intentional or not, the idea that Daenerys may have been carrying Jon Snow's child remains one of the most compelling fan theories in Game of Thrones history. Why would the showrunners cut a pregnancy storyline? If Game of Thrones originally intended for Daenerys to be pregnant, why was the storyline never addressed in Season 8? Given the amount of foreshadowing and thematic setup in Season 7, it seems unusual that the show would build up such an important plot point only to abandon it. While the idea of Daenerys carrying Jon Snow's child would have added significant emotional weight to the final season, several potential reasons explain why the pregnancy subplot may have been cut from the narrative entirely. Whether due to creative choices, production constraints, or concerns about audience reception, there are multiple factors that might have led the showrunners to drop what could have been one of the most impactful twists in the series. Time constraints and a shortened final season. One of the biggest criticisms of Game of Thrones Season 8 was its rushed pacing, with the showrunners condensing what could have been multiple seasons' worth of material into just 6 episodes. Unlike earlier seasons, which took their time developing complex character arcs and slow-burning political conflicts, Season 8 fast-tracked major events, leaving little room for deeper storytelling. A pregnancy storyline, especially one as significant as Daenerys carrying the heir to the Targaryen bloodline, would have required additional screen time and character development. The introduction of a pregnancy would have necessitated several key narrative shifts exploring Daenerys' realization of her condition, how it influenced her decisions regarding the war, how Jon reacted to the news, and how it impacted the power struggles in Westeros. Given that the final season was already struggling to balance Daenerys' descent into madness, Jon's conflicted loyalties, Cersei's resistance, and the battle against the White Walkers, adding a pregnancy subplot may have been seen as too much to fit into the already limited runtime. the showrunners, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, made the controversial decision to reduce the number of episodes in the final season, despite HBO offering more time and resources to extend the show. Had they opted for a 10-episode season instead of 6, they might have had the flexibility to develop more nuanced storylines, including a possible pregnancy. However, their preference for a fast-tracked conclusion meant that many character arcs, including Daenerys' transformation into the Mad Queen, felt abrupt and incomplete. A pregnancy storyline would have required a slower, more emotional build-up, something that Season 8 simply didn't allow. The tragedy of Daenerys' character arc. Daenerys Targaryen's downfall was already one of the most controversial aspects of the final season, with many fans arguing that her descent into madness felt rushed and inconsistent with her character development. From the very beginning of Game of Thrones, Daenerys was portrayed as a revolutionary leader who sought to liberate the oppressed, destroy tyranny, and rule with justice. Her journey from an exiled princess to the mother of dragons and eventually the self-proclaimed Queen of Westeros was filled with moments that emphasized her deep sense of purpose, compassion, and unwavering belief in her destiny. However, the final season accelerated her transformation from a righteous liberator into a ruthless conqueror in a matter of just a few episodes, leaving many viewers frustrated with the lack of gradual development. If the show had introduced a pregnancy into her storyline, it would have complicated her arc even further, adding layers of emotional conflict and moral dilemmas that the final season seemed unwilling to explore. Instead of a queen who felt abandoned and betrayed, a pregnant Daenerys would have had a tangible reason to hope for the future. Her child would have given her a renewed purpose beyond conquest, making it significantly harder for the audience to accept the idea that she would so suddenly and violently destroy King's Landing. While the show attempted to frame her descent into destruction as a result of grief, paranoia, and power-hungry desperation, a pregnancy would have completely changed this narrative, making her more human, more vulnerable, and more sympathetic. One of the core elements of Daenerys' tragic downfall was that she was completely alone by the time she attacked King's Landing. Throughout the series, she built a loyal following and surrounded herself with trusted advisors and friends. However, as the final season unfolded, she systematically lost nearly everyone she loved and relied on Jorah Mormont, Missandei, most of her Dothraki and Unsullied armies, and 2 of her dragons. Each loss chipped away at her emotional stability, reinforcing the show's portrayal of her as a leader who had lost everything, with no one left to anchor her to the ideals she once fought for. By the time she sat on the walls of King's Landing, deciding whether to burn the city, she had no close allies left, only soldiers, political advisors who doubted her, and the voices of her fallen loved ones haunting her. Had she been pregnant, it would have completely altered this dynamic. Instead of being portrayed as a ruler who felt she had lost everything, she would have had a reason to hold on to hope, a reason to consider peace, and a reason to fight for a better future beyond just securing the Iron Throne. The show attempted to justify her destruction of King's Landing by suggesting that she believed fear was the only way to rule, but a pregnancy could have made her reconsider the consequences of her actions. With a child growing inside her, Daenerys would have had more to protect than just her claim to the throne. She would have had a direct heir, a future that depended on stability rather than chaos. Instead of seeing her unravel into paranoia, the show could have explored her struggle between vengeance and the responsibility of motherhood, making her eventual fate all the more tragic. Additionally, a pregnant Daenerys would have made her death even more heartbreaking and controversial. If Jon Snow had killed her knowing she was carrying his child, it would have completely altered the moral and ethical stakes of his decision. Throughout the series, Jon was portrayed as an honorable, duty-driven man who always tried to do the right thing, even when it came at great personal cost. His choice to assassinate Daenerys was framed as a reluctant act of heroism, an impossible choice meant to prevent her from becoming a tyrant. However, if he had known that she was pregnant with his heir, the audience might have seen his actions not as the reluctant sacrifice of a man trying to save the realm, but as an unforgivable betrayal. Instead of being viewed as a hero who saved Westeros, Jon might have been perceived as a murderer who not only took Daenerys' life, but also ended the future of their child. The idea of Daenerys' pregnancy would have introduced a major moral conflict for Jon, as it would have forced him to choose between saving Westeros from what he believed was impending doom or protecting his own flesh and blood. Would he have hesitated? Would he have sought another way to stop her? The emotional weight of this decision would have been far heavier than what was presented in the final season, where Jon was simply left with a choice between loyalty and duty. The showrunners may have feared that adding a pregnancy to the mix would have shifted too much audience sympathy toward Daenerys, making her fiery destruction of King's Landing even harder to justify. Without a pregnancy, the show was able to depict her as a ruler who had reached a point of no return, consumed by power and vengeance. However, if she had been pregnant, it would have been much harder for viewers to accept Jon's decision to kill her, as it would no longer have been about just stopping her reign, but also about destroying the future of House Targaryen. By keeping Daenerys isolated and without any personal attachments, the writers could justify her final actions as those of a ruler who felt she had nothing left to lose. This approach allowed them to portray her as a tragic figure whose quest for power ultimately led to self-destruction, rather than as a mother-to-be who had a future to consider beyond the Iron Throne. A pregnancy subplot would have complicated this perspective, making it harder for the show to present her actions as purely villainous. Had Daenerys been pregnant, the final season could have explored a very different version of her downfall, one where she faced an internal struggle between her vengeful instincts and her responsibility as a future mother. Perhaps she would have still burned King's Landing, but with hesitation, knowing that her child would one day have to answer for her actions. Perhaps Jon would have tried to find another way to stop her rather than killing her outright. Perhaps Daenerys would have survived in some form, choosing exile over destruction for the sake of her child. Ultimately, removing a potential pregnancy from her storyline allowed the showrunners to wrap up her arc in the simplest way possible by making her downfall purely about ambition and unchecked power rather than deeper emotional conflicts. While this approach made for a more decisive ending, it also stripped her story of the nuance and depth that had defined her character throughout the series. A pregnancy could have added layers of tragedy, moral dilemmas, and emotional stakes, making her fate even more impactful. As a result, many fans continue to wonder what might have been if Daenerys' pregnancy had been part of Season 8. Would it have changed how audiences viewed her final choices? Would it have softened her downfall or made Jon's betrayal even more devastating? While we may never know for certain, the idea that Daenerys was carrying Jon Snow's child remains one of the most fascinating and unresolved possibilities in Game of Thrones' controversial final season. A simplified and more predictable ending. One of the most widely discussed criticisms of Game of Thrones Season 8 was its tendency to oversimplify complex narratives in favor of a more straightforward, action-driven conclusion. The early seasons of the show were known for their intricate storytelling, moral ambiguity, and slow-burning political drama, where power struggles unfolded over multiple episodes and character decisions had long-lasting consequences. However, as the series approached its final season, much of this careful world-building was abandoned in favor of fast-paced spectacle. Many of the major twists in Season 8, such as the Night King's sudden death at the hands of Arya Stark, Cersei's surprisingly passive and unceremonious demise, and the shocking decision to crown Bran Stark as king, felt rushed and unearned. These developments left many fans feeling that the show had sacrificed depth and realism for the sake of delivering shocking moments that lacked proper build-up. A pregnancy subplot would have introduced new layers of complexity that the final season simply did not seem willing to explore. If Daenerys had been revealed to be carrying Jon Snow's child, it would have fundamentally altered the stakes of her character arc and forced the narrative to engage with the long-term consequences of her downfall. Instead of a straightforward story where Jon ultimately kills Daenerys to stop her from ruling as a tyrant, the show would have had to grapple with difficult moral and political questions surrounding the Targaryen bloodline, succession, and the future of Westeros. Would Jon have hesitated to betray her if he knew she was carrying his heir? Would her pregnancy have softened her descent into paranoia and destruction, giving her a renewed reason to seek peace rather than war? Would the realm have accepted the child as the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, even after Daenerys' death? These questions would have led to a very different ending, one that may have required additional episodes or even an alternative resolution to the conflict. The showrunners had already decided to condense the final season into just 6 episodes, despite HBO reportedly offering them the opportunity to extend the series. This decision meant that many of the show's storylines had to be resolved quickly, leaving little room for deeper exploration of character motivations or political consequences. A pregnancy subplot would have complicated matters further, as it would have necessitated follow-up on what happened to Daenerys' unborn child. Would the Targaryen bloodline have continued? Would Jon have been forced to raise the child in exile, torn between his duty to Westeros and his love for Daenerys? These lingering questions might have made the show's conclusion even more divisive. Instead of grappling with these complexities, the writers chose a simpler route. Daenerys dies, Jon is exiled, Bran takes the throne, and the Targaryen line effectively ends. While this ending was controversial for its own reasons, it was at least clean and definitive, avoiding the messy political implications that a surviving Targaryen heir would have introduced. If Daenerys had been pregnant, the story would not have been able to end as neatly. There would have been debates over whether her child had a rightful claim to the throne, possibly leading to another civil war. This could have also changed the fate of Jon Snow, as he would have had a personal stake in protecting his child rather than simply accepting exile beyond the wall. The final scene of Jon riding north with the wildlings carried an air of bittersweet closure, but if he had been leaving behind an unborn child, that decision would have felt much more tragic and unresolved. By removing the pregnancy, the show maintained a clear and final break in Daenerys' legacy, ensuring that her downfall remained focused solely on her personal choices and not on potential successors. Without a child, her death marked the definitive end of her vision for the future, allowing the show to frame her as a tragic figure whose ambition ultimately led to her destruction. It also reinforced the idea that the Targaryen dynasty had finally reached its conclusion, with no heirs left to reclaim the throne. Whether this was the right choice is still debated among fans, as many believe that Daenerys' character arc in Season 8 felt rushed and inconsistent with her earlier development. A pregnancy could have provided additional depth to her motivations and forced Jon and the other characters to reckon with the full consequences of their actions. Instead, the show opted for a more simplistic resolution, one that left many viewers questioning what could have been if the final season had been given more time to fully explore its ideas. Behind-the-scenes changes and last-minute script edits. Given the numerous behind-the-scenes changes that affected Game of Thrones in its final seasons, it is possible that Daenerys' pregnancy was originally part of earlier drafts of the script but was later removed due to creative or production-related decisions. As with many aspects of Season 8, the showrunners had to make tough choices about which storylines to keep and which to abandon, leading to a season that felt both rushed and incomplete. If a pregnancy arc was ever in the works, it may have been seen as too difficult to fully explore within the limited time remaining. There have been multiple reports suggesting that early outlines of Season 8 contained scenes and subplots that were eventually scrapped. The final season had a notoriously rushed production schedule, with filming compressed into a much shorter period than previous seasons. Many cast members, including Emilia Clarke and Kit Harington, have spoken about how difficult and intense the production process was, with some actors even admitting that they were shocked by certain final decisions in the scripts. The compressed timeline and pressure to deliver a satisfying ending may have forced the writers to remove subplots that could have complicated the resolution of the story. If a pregnancy storyline was initially planned, it is possible that it was cut during rewrites in an effort to streamline the narrative and keep the focus on Daenerys' transformation into the Mad Queen. Game of Thrones has a long history of changing major character arcs at the last minute, sometimes leading to abrupt shifts that deviated from earlier foreshadowing. For example, Arya Stark's original storyline was rumored to involve a romance with Jon Snow, a subplot that was ultimately scrapped in favor of her independent assassin arc. Likewise, Bran Stark's coronation as King of Westeros was reportedly not planned far in advance, but was instead decided late in the writing process. Several actors, including Isaac Hempstead Wright, who played Bran, expressed surprise at this decision, suggesting that the ending evolved as the show was being written. Given this pattern of last-minute changes, it is entirely plausible that a pregnancy storyline for Daenerys was abandoned late in development, leading to the inconsistencies we now see in Season 8. If Daenerys' pregnancy had been part of an earlier draft of the script, it would explain why Season 7 contained so much foreshadowing regarding her ability to bear children. The conversations between Daenerys and Jon about her supposed infertility, as well as the hints at legacy and succession, seem too deliberate to be meaningless. These moments suggest that a pregnancy may have been considered as a major development for her character, only for the idea to be discarded before filming. The decision to remove this subplot, if it ever existed, likely came down to the fact that it would have required additional time and emotional complexity, making Jon's ultimate betrayal of Daenerys even harder to justify. Another factor to consider is the impact that a pregnancy would have had on the show's ending. If Daenerys had been carrying Jon's child, her death would have been even more controversial, as it would have meant the end of not only her reign but also the last surviving heir of House Targaryen. This could have drastically altered the final power dynamics in Westeros, raising questions about whether Jon would have been forced to take responsibility for their unborn child. Instead of a clean break from Targaryen rule, the show would have had to explore the consequences of a Targaryen heir still existing, which could have complicated the final resolution. Given that the showrunners were determined to wrap up the series within 6 episodes, they may have seen this additional storyline as unnecessary or too difficult to resolve in such a short amount of time. Ultimately, whether or not Daenerys' pregnancy was ever part of the original script remains a mystery. However, given the way Season 7 was structured and the number of hints dropped about her potential to conceive, it seems unlikely that these moments were meaningless. The inconsistencies in Season 8, combined with the show's history of last-minute script changes, suggest that a pregnancy storyline may have been removed during the final stages of development. This would explain why some scenes in Season 8, such as Daenerys placing a hand over her stomach, feel like unresolved moments that were meant to lead to something more. If this theory is true, it raises even more questions about what Game of Thrones' final season could have been if it had taken the time to fully explore all of the ideas it had set up. Final thoughts: was Daenerys really pregnant? While there is significant evidence to suggest that Game of Thrones originally planned to explore a pregnancy storyline for Daenerys, it was ultimately left unresolved or scrapped in Season 8. From the heavy foreshadowing in Season 7 to the subtle visual and narrative clues in Season 8, it seems likely that Daenerys being pregnant was at least considered by the showrunners at some point. If Daenerys had been revealed to be carrying Jon Snow's child, it would have completely changed the dynamic of the final season, adding an even greater sense of tragedy to her downfall. Her death would have left a Targaryen heir behind, forcing Jon to confront not only the guilt of killing her, but also the responsibility of raising their child. Whether intentional or not, Game of Thrones left fans with one final mystery, one that will continue to be debated for years to come. Was Daenerys truly pregnant in Season 8, or was it all just clever misdirection? In the end, the answer may never be fully known, but the theory remains one of the most compelling, unanswered questions in the entire series.